Thank you everyone for attending the National Farmers Union webinar series, NFUniversity. Our presenters today are Dr. Joanne Thiessen-Martens, Dr. Marcos Cordero, and Dr. Michelle Karkner, and the topic is LEAP, Leveraging Ecosystems to Transform Agriculture on the Prairies. The NFU is a partner in the Leveraging Ecosystems to Transform Agriculture on the Prairies project at the University of Manitoba. The LEAP project explores agricultural intensification strategies and farming systems designs that use technology and nature-based tools to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, capture carbon, support biodiversity, and help agriculture mitigate to climate change through farmer engagement, First Nations self-determined farming systems, landscape analysis, net zero farming systems, future farm scenarios activities. This NFUniversity section focuses landscape analysis activity evaluates perennialization strategies in the Eastern Prairie region. The Future Farm Scenarios activity utilizes Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Holos model to answer what-if questions regarding land management decisions that affect a farm's greenhouse gas emissions. And our presenters today. Dr. Joanne Thiessen-Martens is an assistant professor in the Department of Soil Science at the University of Manitoba and is the activity leader of the landscape analysis activity of the LEAP project. She focuses on nutrient flows and dynamics in agroecosystems, specifically on closing nutrient cycles at the local and regional level and improving soil fertility management in diversified cropping systems. Dr. Marcos Cordero is an associate professor in the Department of Animal Science at the University of Manitoba and the activity leader of the Future Farm Scenarios activity of the LEAP project. His research is on using cutting-edge data analysis and modeling tools to enhance productivity and the sustainability of agroecosystems. Dr. Michelle Karkner is the Director of Research and Partnerships for the LEAP project and a research associate at the University of Manitoba's Department of Plant Science. Her past work as the coordinator for Canada's first nationwide participatory plant breeding program was integral to her PhD research in crop physiology and agronomy. Currently, she is researching diversified cropping systems and crop adaptation to low input and high stress environments. Joanne, Marcos, and Michelle, I will pass the mic to you.
Great. Thank you so much, James. And I'm so excited to see so many people registered and joining this event. So thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen. And this way. Can you confirm that you can see the presentation?
Yep.
And not the presenter slides?
We can see the presentation. Yep.
Okay, so again, my name's Michelle Karkner. I'm the Director of Research and Partnerships in this project, and I will go into a little bit more detail of my role in this large grant. But I really wanted to start off from the beginning when we heard about this research call from Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada, and Circ and Shirk. And so from a bird's eye view, we can start with talking about the challenges. And so when we think about the challenges, one great way of kind of encapsulating all the different things that are going on around the world and globally is this idea of the planetary boundaries framework. And this paper, which I have in the slide here, which was published in Science Advances, identifies 9 processes that are critical for maintaining the stability and the resilience of Earth systems as a whole. And agriculture plays a major role in the detrimental and potentially benefits of keeping within these planetary boundaries. And I would specifically point to the biogeochemical flows in terms of the amount of nitrogen that we're using and phosphorus that we're taking up from the earth or creating from the atmosphere and putting in our cropping systems, and also the biosphere integrity, so the genetic diversity and the functional diversity of our earth. And so at the University of Manitoba, when a group of professors got together to talk about how to meet this call and to also meet the challenges of these of the planetary boundaries, we started thinking about the role that agriculture plays. So essentially, this call was in response to the Paris Climate Agreement that that Canada had signed in 2016. And so a way that the Canadian government was taking action was through science. And so the research call was about reinforcing, coordinating, and scaling up Canada's domestic research capabilities, the partnerships between universities, organizations from private, public, and nonprofit sectors. And so this was the NSERC-SSHRC Sustainable Agriculture Initiative. And so when we, as academics, we were talking about how to meet this call, we really wanted to get a sense of what's going on the ground and how to enhance sustainable practices and scale up sustainable practices. So I know there's a lot of diverse people in the group, and one way that we can try to engage with you from the beginning and kind of get the grease the wheels and think about sustainable practices and where we're all coming from is through a poll. And so I'm going to just change my screen for 2 seconds. And I'm going to confirm that you can see the Mentimeter, but I'd like you to scan this QR code or join menti.com and use the code 99641609. And this is just a great way for us to get a sense of where people are at, if they are farmers, what kind of operations you run, and you can select multiple at the same time. So if you're a grain and livestock farmer, or you're livestock and horticulture, you can select multiple. So I'll just wait. Oh, I love seeing these. I love Mentimeter. So we got some livestock, grain, horticulture. That's great. Okay, it's slowing down. So you can see that we've got an equal amount of, oh, we're changing a bit. That's great. Oh, I love this. This is a nice even split amongst grain, livestock, and horticulture. So when we're talking about the project, think about ways in which you could possibly engage, or the things that kind of come to your mind in terms of your own cropping system. It's great. Thanks, everyone. And now everybody else knows who's in the audience. So that's wonderful. So because we wanted to start this project very much from the ground up, we wanted to capture what farmers are currently doing and what they think about their own system. So another question I have here, and this should show up on your phone, is how sustainable are we? And so I want you to agree, either strongly disagree or strongly agree to the statement. On my own farm, my production practices lead to long-term sustainable production. And so the 7 would be like an average of what everybody is submitting. And then you can see the distribution in the background. So I can see some people think that they strongly agree. Some people are kind of in the middle. No one's strongly disagreeing. Give it about 30 more seconds. It's great. So somewhere in the middle, about 7. Okay. Great. Okay. All right. And then my last piece of engagement is, what production practices are sustainable to you? And so you can type in there anything that comes to mind. It can be using different specific varieties. It can be, I don't want to influence anyone. So hopefully as people press enter, some things will show up. Oh, I love this. Okay. 2 people. diversification. And then I think if one is very large, it means that multiple people have have typed in. So livestock integration is large, diversification, agroecology. Some people say that practices are not very important. Closed loop nutrient cycling, I'm guessing. Companion cropping. Managing dynamically, carbon-based, sea-based fertilizers, low emission. It's great. Compost, permaculture, rotations. Great. Rainwater harvesting, labor justice. Awesome. Okay, 36 responses. Okay, so I will move on. So this is just to get everyone's kind of their brains flowing. So when we talk about here, the idea of leveraging ecosystems to transform agriculture, we were really trying to think about what ways does a natural system function, and what ways in agriculture can we mimic some of the natural systems to function more ecologically. So we can try to produce food in relationship with ecosystems rather than in opposition to complex ecological function. And I really like to show this idea of ecological succession because in natural landscapes, they're constantly trying to move towards complex perennial systems. So maybe in Southern Ontario, which is where I'm from, the complex community at the end of the day would have been some kind of deciduous forest, whereas on the prairies, because we had the bison for thousands of years, it would have been grassland, for example. But we're just the ecosystems are constantly trying to move towards complex systems and to fill lots of different niches. But in agriculture, we're constantly trying to move plant or ecosystems from this annual plant system back into destruction of 0 years, so nothing growing. And so in natural ecosystems, this could be fire, but in agriculture, we use tillage or we use herbicides to try to take that landscape back down to simple plants so that we can plant annual plants. And that's why a lot of times we deal with annual weeds, is because we're constantly moving in this pioneer species. But we know that when we are constantly trying to move back this ecological succession, there's a lot of detrimental things that happen in the ecosystem. So for example, we have poor soil structure, we have soil erosion, we have herbicide resistance because we're constantly trying to move that back to 0 years, and annual plants have evolved to deal with that. We have nitrous oxide emissions, very fragile against environmental shocks, pest and disease pressure, and loss of biodiversity. So for the LEAP project, we tried to think about, well, what are some of the characteristics on the prairies that we can try to mimic to kind of bring stability into our agroecosystems and working with nature? And some of the practices that we came up with that a lot of other people have brought up in the Mentimeter was efficient nutrient cycling, no-till, using cover crops, including diversity and rotations, perennial grains, crop livestock integration. So these are all things that are already on farmers' minds, you know, as professors and academics, and we want to capture what farmers are already doing. But we wanted to capture that in a very holistic way and try to leverage what farmers are doing and understand why farmers are doing what they're doing and amplify it. And so by the time that we got the proposal together, we decided on 5 distinct activities. So these 5 distinct activities started off with community engagement. So we wanted to know why farmers and landowners are doing these sustainable practices, and what are the metrics that actually hinder or help farmers do these sustainable practices and incorporate well-being, mental health into that. And what's also included in that is how farmers react to best management practices of initiatives that governments asked for. So for example, federal government, they said we want a 30% reduction in nitrous oxide emissions. Well, farmers reacted, many farmers and commodity groups reacted to that as, that's a reduction in fertilizer. Well, we want to try to capture, well, what is the messaging and where are farmers at to respond to these different I'm trying to find my words, policies. Another one is the First Nations case study, and I'll go into a little bit more detail with that. It's headed up by Dr. Melissa Arcana at University of Saskatchewan. But we wanted to try to understand First Nations farmers specifically because they have very distinct challenges that are different from other farmers. And then we also wanted to look at landscape analysis. So trying to capture data from things that farmers are already doing, and also trying to look at field studies. So for example, looking at more detailed ways of different practices that you can kind of only do on smaller plot research. And then of course, future farm scenarios, which Dr. Cordero will talk about, but this idea of taking farmers and leaping them to the next level, but doing that in a low cost way with the Holos model. So we also recognized that we can't do this alone. And so we recruited 7 different partners in the project, National Farmers Union being one of them. And all of these different partners have different mandates that they themselves are concerned with. And so we want to tap into what these partners are already doing, leverage what they're already doing, enhance what they're already doing in order to affect final change. And I know that this slide is very busy, but this is really what we want to do is drive adoption and help agriculture leap into a new paradigm. And so back to these 5 interrelated activities, I will shift it over to Dr. Tisa Martins. We're going to talk a little bit more in detail about the future farm scenarios and the landscape analysis, and then I will talk a little bit more about the other 3, but I will shift it on over to Joanne.
Good afternoon, everybody. So happy to see so many people joining this webinar today. I'm glad to see so much interest in our project that we are just really getting up and running. We have been very busy planning and acquiring equipment and starting to get the wheels in motion so that we can be doing lots of research over the next few years. So my name's Joanne Thiessen Martins. As James introduced me earlier, I am a assistant professor in the Department of Soil Science here at the University of Manitoba, and I am leading this activity on the landscape analyses, is what we're calling it. So essentially what we want to do in this part of the project is actually look at what farmers are currently doing, what they're already doing. We know that there are innovators who have been adopting novel practices already many years ago and implementing them well at the leading edge of that adoption curve. And we want to see now what's been the net effect of those beneficial practices that they've implemented today after a certain amount of time in those practices. So that's where we developed our objective, is to look at these perennialization strategies, like Michelle mentioned, where we're trying to mimic natural ecosystems a little more closely than our typical annual systems, looking at perennialization strategies that are already being implemented and how those can shift our agricultural systems towards net zero, which is, of course, one of the goals that we have committed to through the Paris Accord, but also practices that can help support other goals. As Michelle showed with those planetary boundaries, we have a lot of other environmental goals that we need to be thinking of, but then we also have agronomic goals related to farmer livelihoods and related to a safe and abundant food supply locally and internationally, and so on. So we propose to do this through 2 streams, I'll call them, and I'm going to focus on one more than the other, but they are interlinked and they together lead us to what we actually want to accomplish at the end. So our two activities in this part are a geospatial analysis, shown here in the blue, and then in the kind of pinky purple color, a landscape survey. I'm going to come back to the ideas shown in these boxes here. So all the words here are not so important at the moment, other than to just say on the geospatial analysis side, we basically want to understand what has been happening where in the Prairie region. And we're focusing on the eastern prairies, Manitoba and eastern Saskatchewan in the black soil zone. And what has been happening where, and where can we make some changes. Then on the right-hand side in the purple, the landscape survey, that's where we actually go out to all these places, farms where practices have been implemented already, and see what the results of those practices are. Then we hope to draw that all together to not only understand what is happening so far, but then also be able to prioritize certain practices for certain regions. So we can have locally adapted recommendations for perennialization approaches. So being a little bit more like a natural ecosystem for any site in this Eastern Prairie region. This map shows approximately where we want to do our studies. These are not actual locations that have been identified. It's just a concept of where we think that they may be. We're just in the process of finalizing the first sites now. But the idea is we will have a whole bunch of locations spread all around this region, focusing on that Eastern Prairie region, as I said. And we're going to be looking at clusters of farms in different areas. And within each cluster, we want to look at some fields that are simple annual systems, just because those are currently very important to our economic, our agricultural systems here in the prairies. But we also want to look at diversified perennial systems, as well as some things that are sort of in the middle. And I'll come back to what those might be in just a moment. Now, I need to tell you a little bit about our experimental design here because it's important. We've realized we can't measure everything everywhere. And so we have some different levels of what we're going to be measuring at different sites. And we were thinking about this quite a bit, I think, during the Olympics. And so we have gold, silver, and bronze in our minds. And so we have some gold sites, just 6 fields in Manitoba, where we're going to be doing a lot of measurements, time-consuming, equipment intensive, time-intensive measurements. Then we have silver sites, and those are going to be scattered all over the place and involve just a little bit less sampling, but still quite a lot. And then we have some bronze sites that are going to focus actually more on those are the farmers that are going to focus in the engagement activity that Michelle mentioned earlier. But we're still interested in collecting some samples from those farms. So these sites are all going to be grouped in little clusters where we have, again, this range of annual to perennial systems. So we know that systems don't necessarily fall into neat little categories of, is it just annual or is it just perennial? And so we're envisioning this continuum of simple annual moving all the way across into diversified perennial, and specific fields may fall at different points along that continuum. So for our gold sites, especially, we want to focus on a simple annual system there on the left, a diversified perennial system on the right, and then in between something that is maybe has some features of a perennial system, but still uses some annual crops, for example. I should mention that through all of this, we are focusing on broadacre production systems of grains and forages primarily, because that is really what dominates our agricultural region here in the prairies. So similar to the gold sites, we can see that in the silvers, in those silver locations, there may be farms or fields that are spread all along that continuum and at slightly different points along that continuum. as they implement different practices that are closer or farther from those diversified perennial systems. So what might these be? Those annual systems, like I said, are going to be our broadacre crops. For example, corn, wheat, soybeans, canola is another important one here in the prairies. Any annual crop, which is really the majority of our acres in the prairies. Those diversified perennial systems, of course, will include perennial forages. Those are the most common types of perennial systems that occur on large acreage fields here. But also we do have some growers in the province that are producing perennial grains that are being developed here at the University of Manitoba by Dr. Doug Catani, who is shown here and is part of our project. And so we are looking at those types of perennial systems as well. And there we're really, on this side, we're really focused on those systems that are dominated or almost exclusively use perennials. Then in the middle is where things are a little bit different. We see potentially lots of different ways that farmers could be creating an intermediate type of production system that's somewhere in between annual and perennial. One traditional system here in the prairies would be a grain and forage rotation. As you see in this photo, they have some forages in the front, annual crops in the back. Every few years, those crops would be shifted around so that annuals were grown, are now grown where perennials were before, and vice versa. That system is not as common as it used to be, but it still exists here in the Prairie region and many other places as well. Another more novel approach is to use intercropping and cover cropping to try to simulate a perennial system, such as the very long growing season, having living roots in the soil right from snowmelt to snowfall, but using annual crops. So this photo shows corn with hairy vetch growing down below the corn canopy. That hairy vetch will continue to grow after the corn is harvested well into the fall, and in some climates will even overwinter and grow again the next spring. So in this middle space is where we're really looking for innovative farmers that we can study to see how their systems are performing now over time. And that leads me to what we want to measure on these farms. We have an extremely long list of measurements that we want to collect. This is really just a summary. In each of these rows of the table, there's many sub-items that aren't shown that we want to measure, but they fall into some broad categories, such as greenhouse gas emissions, the carbon and water balance in these soils and fields, all kinds of different soil properties. Someone was teasing us that we just took the whole table of contents from the soil methods book and put it in the proposal, and it's almost true. Lots of different plant related variables as well, the productivity, the community composition, weeds, crops, different types of plants, the quality of those crops, and so on. And then we also want to look at insects, arthropods, the diversity, the stability of those communities, and the services that they may be providing through pollination, for example, or predators that are helping to suppress pests and that kind of thing. We'll need some information from the farmer about how they're managing their fields. We'll hope to collect some demographic information from them, as well as we are going to mine every database that we can think of to find out about the site properties. So we can get everything from the soil texture to, stoniness, salinity, the topography of the field, all kinds of different things that we can get from existing databases. So why do we want to measure so many things? Well, it comes back to those objectives that we had as part of the landscape study. We want to characterize the relationships among all these different types of measurements. So what the site is like, the soil properties, soil microorganisms, plants, the weather and all those kinds of things, and how those work together or maybe against each other to affect our net zero outcomes. And specifically, we want to look at those under different land uses in those, the annual, intermediate, and perennial sites. This asking this question and collecting all this data will help us to test some assumptions about what goes with what. There aren't a lot of studies out there that really compare long-term land use under realistic conditions in all these kinds of different environments. And so we don't really know too much about whether how much the soil properties may actually interact with pollinators or something like that. Okay, so there's lots of unanswered questions there. Another reason that we need all this information for this is that some of these variables we want to measure, especially those related to net zero outcomes, are very expensive and difficult to measure. And so we are hoping through this activity to find perhaps some indicators that are easier to measure, but that we can use in lieu of some of the expensive equipment. Also, we recognize that soil carbon changes very slowly in most cases. And so we are trying to find maybe some specific types of soil organic matter that respond more quickly as an indicator of longer-term soil carbon storage. So just really quickly, a little bit about how we want to measure these greenhouse gases. This is some of the equipment that we plan to use. It requires a lot of infrastructure and a lot of visits to the field, but it can provide us with some really, really important data. These towers that we plan to install at our gold sites, so 6 different fields, are commonly known as eddy covariance towers or flux towers, and they measure water, carbon exchange, in some cases other types of gases between the crop and the soil or the land and the atmosphere. And this lets us understand, especially related to our those net zero goals, how much carbon plants are taking up from the atmosphere and then storing in their biomass, and then eventually, hopefully, transferring to the soil. So Dr. Enrique Carvalho, who's on this project, he calls this the breathing of the biosphere. And you can get some data like this. I'm going to focus on the bottom part of this graph. But this, just quickly, is the data that comes from these flux towers. You can see on the bottom is time in hours. So this is a 3-day period that is shown here. The top is showing the evapotranspiration. So that's the water being pumped from the crop up into the atmosphere during the day. And then during the night, there's not too much happening. Down here in the bottom, this is the carbon flux. So this is essentially photosynthesis in action during the day. So during the daylight periods, you can see the line going down. That is carbon being drawn from the atmosphere down into the plant canopy. Then at night, plants aren't photosynthesizing, but they still respire just like you and I do. And so they're giving off a little bit of carbon dioxide during the night. So over a whole growing season or a whole year, they can add up all of this information to find out over that whole year how much carbon was drawn down into the soil or into that plant biomass. And from that, we can answer the question, was that crop a carbon sink or a net carbon source? As well as questions about water use and that kind of thing. We also want to know about nitrous oxide emissions. These are a very important greenhouse gas, of course. And we measure those with these little chambers that are installed in the soil. Someone comes, puts the cap on them, waits a certain amount of time, draws out a gas sample with a syringe, and then has that analyzed for the gases in it. That happens weekly or more often. It's a lot of work, but we have a very dedicated PhD student who's already got her plans in place for how she's going to do all of this. So this is the type of information that we really are lacking about those intermediate types of production systems, and that we really hope to answer with this experiment or this study. So that's the greenhouse gases, carbon and water balance. as I said, we can only really measure that on a few farms. And so we want to look at all these other soil properties, like I was saying, to see if there's any other measurements that we can take that we could use to predict these things that are so expensive and hard to measure. So for example, could we actually predict that carbon flux into the crop simply based on the plant productivity and the soil type? We don't know yet, but that's one hypothesis. Or could we predict those nitrous oxide emissions based just on the soil nitrate, which is much easier to measure than the emissions themselves, the soil moisture and fertilizer application rates and that kind of thing. So we don't know, but we hope to find out. The second reason we're measuring so many things is that, as I alluded to, we want to look at those linkages between net zero outcomes and our other agronomic environmental goals. So just simply, are there some synergies? As in, are the production practices that are really good for net zero, are they also good for other things? Are they supporting more beneficial organisms? Are they supporting better ecosystem function? Or we may find that there are some trade-offs. Are those net zero systems perhaps less productive because maybe less fertilizer was used, or just the types of crops that are grown? Or do they contribute to nutrient runoff or other environmental issues? Again, we don't yet know, but we hope to find out, because we don't want to necessarily sacrifice one outcome for another, or if we do, we want to understand what how to make those choices. So again, that's why we need to study and measure so many things. You might be wondering through all of this, what about these bronze sites? I haven't been talking about them much. As I said just briefly earlier, those are linked to our engagement activity, and where we really want to try to get at the question of whether there are certain relationships between farmer attitudes, their well-being, their sense of self-advocacy, and things like that, and the way that they farm and the way that their farm performs and some of these things. So we'll be collecting some information from those farms again. Again, this is something, this is has not been explored much in research so far. So in the geospatial analysis, then our goal is simply to take the information that we get from all those farm sites, as shown here in the bottom map, combine it with satellite imagery and analysis of maps of the Prairie region to understand then what works where. Then from that, we should be able to make recommendations for changes when there are growers who want to make a change on their farm, or policymakers who want to support a certain type of production system in a certain area. They can make a recommendation that is suitable for that area. So that leads back to our goal is to provide that site-specific characterization or understanding of how all of these different practices perform for all these different outcomes, and then provide a ranking of suitable activities or perennialization approaches for any one site. Now, as you can imagine, this is a lot of work. I have a big team working with me. There's 12 of us from mostly the University of Manitoba, but also the University of Saskatchewan, in several different departments, all working together to try to make this happen. So it's a very exciting activity, and we're looking forward to being able to share some results about it as time goes on. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Marcos Cordero, who's going to talk about the future farm scenarios part of this project.
Thank you, Joanne. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Joanne said, my name is Marcos, and I'll be leading the activity 5 of future farm scenarios. But by no means I'm working by myself. So you see it here down below, the list of people working in our team to work to develop this activity. And I'd like to acknowledge the second name there, Dr. Roland Krobel. He's the development lead for the Holos model, out of AAFC in Lethbridge. So we work together in this activity to be able to synthesize, create a synthesis of what we heard so far from Joanne, get a lot of this information and try to include it in the model so that we can leverage this data and apply it to sites where we didn't conduct the research. So this is the whole idea about that. And we are following this overall diagram here where you want to develop those scenarios, as Joanne and Michelle talked about, innovative scenarios that don't fall into the business as usual categories. They fall somewhere in between. They might not be completely new because farmers are already using them, but they are new from a science perspective because you have no measurements about them. So another big component of this whole idea is to do this through a consultation process so that farmers are heard. We want to see what they are doing, what they feel works and doesn't work, and then learn from that to create those scenarios and then apply those scenarios to the simulation. So for the remainder of my talk, I will mostly talk about what we hope to do in terms of the model development, right? Development, because you already heard about the research piece. Okay, so I don't think I need to talk about to anyone in this meeting about the importance of climate change. We know that is happening. You see, a lot of interest from government to farmers about the impact of this can have in agriculture. And it's important for us to get a handle on how agriculture is playing, the role that agriculture is playing in climate change. So for sometimes it's important to do the research, right? When you're breaking ground in terms of science, it's important to do the field studies type of research that you heard about a second ago from Joanne, but also trying to leverage that and build this into the model so that you can look at different aspects that the science, the field research doesn't allow us to. So, because we cannot conduct research everywhere, right? So there's implications for cost, time, availability. So it's important models fill this gap and they help us to gain some insights about those locations for which you don't have any measurements. Okay, so for this particular project, we decided to work with the Holos model. There is a couple features of Holos that really lend itself for this project. The first one being it's a whole farm model. So that means this model has runs detailed simulations for specific components of the farm. So as you can see in this picture here, it includes livestock, it includes the crop side, and also includes the machinery that goes into this. And I'll describe this a little bit more in detail in the slides coming up. Okay, so specifically, this model was has been developed with two major guiding principles. One being transparency. So if you go online in the model webpage, you can see all the documentation about what the model does, how it calculates, what it calculates. And also it's an open source so that people can take the model, develop it, and try to move the science ahead. The other thing is that's really important is to have a high degree of reliability of the model. And due to that, only science-based review goes into the model. So that means when the information, people have sometimes empirical information, but we cannot include this in the model because it's not being they're not being published and peer-reviewed. So we try to keep that criterion high on the list here as well. Okay, so in a nutshell, what the model does, it calculates emissions from, for example, starting here with livestock, right? So we have the different types of emissions, greenhouse gases, and ammonia as well, and indirect emissions. So the model also tracks emissions from excretion, in this case, manure, for example. You can see the different sources of emissions there. And also keeps track of the crop and machinery that's used in any farm operation. So in that sense, the model is really complete and holistic, therefore it's named Holos. They also keep track of crop and shelter belts. This is something that's new to the model and it has been implemented in recent years. And also we keep track of upstream emissions, for example, how much emissions took place to get the fertilizer that's going to be used in the farm. So the model keeps track of that as well. Specifically about the type of emissions, when we talk about livestock piece, so we have the different types of gases, right? As I mentioned before, enteric methane, manure methane. We have direct emissions of nitrous oxide that's coming from fertilizer application, for example, and also have ammonia and the direct emission of nitrous oxide again. And as you can see from the right-hand side of the slide, we use different methodology to estimate those, right? Sometimes you use, IPCC has different levels of complexity that goes from tier 1. This is a more general coarse information, global information sometimes. IPCC has a methodology that's tier 2. This is where Holos fits in for the most part. That means you have a country-specific numbers. This is where we're working here with emission factors developed for Canada and in Canada. This is where research programs like the Joan just described, and also the other ones that Michelle is going to talk about at the end of the presentation, will fit into the model. So we use a different a range of methodologies depending on the livestock that we're working with, depending on the type of emissions we're talking about as well. Okay, so as you can see here, some of the references that you have for that as well. When it comes to crops, we also have, again, emissions from direct and indirect emissions of nitrous oxide. We have the carbon emissions, as you showed the graph there. We also have the shelter bed component. So what's happening in Holos is it's been through a period of very fast development. As science becomes available, we're trying to, or Roland does try to implement that into the model so that we can represent the cropping systems more characteristic of the prairies. Sometimes if the practice is too new, it becomes a challenge for us to implement that. And this is the beauty of this project, because you're looking at practice that is not widely adopted yet, but there's people out there doing it. So we're trying to leverage this type of data sets. The model also, one of the new implementations is the simulation of anaerobic digestion. So this is something people are using already for manure, for example, and residues. So you can see, you can keep track of the emissions from that process, and also keep track of what's going on with the digestate after the digestion took place. Okay, so who was the model developed? Like, who was in mind when the team set out to develop this model? This, of course, was firstly meant for farmers. I know Roland and his team are very active in terms of trying to get farmers engaged with the development, in the use of the model. So Roland travels across Canada every year, talking to farmers, talking to commodity groups, trying to show how the model and facilitate the adoption of the model by farmers in these groups. And with the discussion about climate change and management practices, this becomes really, really important here, right? Because now farmers can adopt the model and do what-if scenarios to see if they adopt this practice, or if they try something else in terms of cropping systems, how would this impact the carbon footprint, for example. The model is also useful for policymakers. We have seen renewed interest in that front, especially, after climate change has become front and center in the recent years. So you see a lot of government agencies funding research on climate change. So policy is also picking up on tools that can be used to assess those scenarios. So we can look at different targets, for example, setting targets, or seeing which practice is more prone for a certain region of the country, for example, and then develop programs and policies based on those. And finally, which is the case here, the model lends itself for research, and this is how we're trying to implement it for this project. Food processors and also supermarkets, so people can also use this down on the food chain, right? So the model can also be adopted at that point to see farm gate to market, for example, type of emissions. So I'd like to just run real quick here over a few screenshots of the model. The model has been completely revamped from its previous versions, version 3, to the current version, which is version 4. It becomes much more user-friendly and much more interactive and graphical. Okay, before it had a spreadsheet-like type of feel. Now it's much more graphical and modern. So it always starts with, if you want to have the model running, it always starts by you selecting, dropping a pin, as you can see in red here, where your farm is. So by doing this, the model will select the soil types, texture, you select weather data as well for your farm. So all of that is taken care in the background. Then it comes the part of the model that most people will spend most of the time, which is characterizing your farm. So you can do livestock, as I said, several types of livestock, like dairy, beef, for example. You can also do several types of cropping systems with a number of oilseed, pulse, small grain crops. There's a large variety of crops that you can use, as well as management practices. So you can actually try to get as close as possible to current practice that are widely adopted. If the practice is kind of novel, then it might not be in the model yet. And this is exactly the reason why we use the science from this project to inform the model development, to fill that gap.
Sorry to interrupt, Marcos. So just a reminder that you have 5 minutes left.
Okay, so I'll just finalize this here. So this is just a screenshot of the cropping systems that you can develop in the model as well. And finally, what you get out of this, once you characterize your model, you have the output of the model in terms of emissions that can be broken down or summarized according to the focus that you have for your assessment. Okay, so I'd like to go back to this. This is my last slide. I'll invite Michelle back, but I'd just like to reinforce once again that what's in the middle of the spectrum is what we try to focus on this project, as well as develop a dialogue, because we don't have a set, it's not written on stone, these scenarios. We're still developing them as we talk to farmers and learn about what they're doing. So with that, I'd like to invite Michelle back to just conclude the presentation.
Okay, hi. So I will just briefly touch on the other 3 activities just to round out the project so everyone has a general idea of what we are wanting to do. But if you want more information on all of the different activities, we have a pretty comprehensive website, which I will have a QR code at the end of the presentation to share. So in the farmer engagement activity, which is headed by Megan King and Dr. Kyle Bobby Wash, and then we're also collaborating with Dr. Brianna Hagan at the Canadian Centre for Agricultural Wellbeing. We want to know about farmers' concerns about policies and programs. We want to know about farmer perspectives about well-being, and we also want to know how farmers see their farm for future generations. Of course, I don't have time to go into detail about that, but that's generally what the engagement portion is looking at. In terms of the First Nations project, we know that agriculture is the dominant land use for First Nations reserves in the Prairie region, and that there are hundreds of thousands of acres being managed by Indigenous communities, but a very small amount of farmers. So the Dr. Melissa Arcan and Dr. Kyle Bobby Wash are looking towards trying to identify Indigenous communities' agricultural initiatives and priorities and integrate Indigenous defined metrics of agricultural sustainability within our broader net zero metrics, and co-design some beneficial management practices that are tailored towards Indigenous perspectives. And then finally, the net zero farming system study. So we incorporated this because there are some extra practices and questions that we had during our discussions that we wanted to look at more with detail. So we have an existing cover crop system study that we're leveraging for the project. We also have a long-term crop livestock integration study with Dr. Martin Nenson's long-term Glenlee rotation. And then we're also looking at perennial pollinator strips. And so you can see that we have more collaborators and other professors involved in this project. And then my role is to try to, as director, is to try to connect what science is generated and integrate that knowledge amongst teams and different industry partners. So I have a bird's eye view on what every team lead and every team member is doing. And I'm also trying to make sure that the partners that we have signed on for the project are their goals, objectives, and needs and interests are also fully integrated into the research questions. And so with that, I'd like to thank our partners and our funders, and I wanted to share some QR codes. So Dr. Melissa Arcand is interested in talking to First Nations farmers. This is the survey for the Activity 3 landscape activity that Dr. Tisa Martins talked about, and of course our website, which has a lot more detail on the different projects. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joanne, Marcos, and Michelle. It's really great to hear about this project. It's a massive project and so much going on. It's great to see it all integrated, and certainly can delve a bit more into all of the other aspects of the project in question and answer period if folks are interested.